So it's my distinguished pleasure to announce our virtual keynote address by Professor Sony Kapoor. Sony Kapoor is a macroeconomist, investment expert, sustainability advisor, technology evangelist, and development enthusiast, and has successfully tackled many important policy issues as well as investment challenges. And so his portfolio career spans investment banking, strategy consulting, advising technology startups, as well as multinational companies. And he has advised several dozen governments. And currently is a professor at the European Institute in Florence on climate, geoeconomics, and finance. Has several advising roles, partly on accelerating climate action. And as such, also for scaling up development finance, was recognized as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum and has been awarded a presidential fellowship by George Soros for being an accomplished policy entrepreneur. And therefore, with no further ado, Sony, please give it away. We're very much looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Thanks.
Wonderful. I hope you can hear me. I'm trying to start my video, but it says it's been stopped by the host. So if you'd like to see me, you can have it on. Otherwise,
love to see you.
I will try and soothe you with my voice. Still says you can't start your video because your host has stopped it. Shall we just begin? And then, if you can start the video, that's fine. Otherwise, I'm happy being the disembodied voice in the background.
Yeah, please, go ahead.
All right. Oh, well, here I am.
We're trying to work it out on our end.
Okay. All right. Okay, here goes. So I will try and be brief, mostly because I'm not there, and it's much harder to keep your attention on a talking head at the screen. And second, it's your lunch break, and I heard you guys chitter-chatter, and I don't want to eat much more into that. So let me just paint a broad context why the discussion you're having today and the previous meetings and the ones you'll have are so critical and central to civilization, nothing short of human civilization. So if you look at the broad history of everything that we take for granted as part of civilization, all human prosperity, all the fantastic infrastructure you see around you, medical advances and everything, right? So all of that has been driven by only two factors throughout human history. And that is human ingenuity, human creativity, also broadly called human capital. And the second is exploitation of natural capital, broadly defined, right? Of which inhabitable planet and stable climate is one. But of course, you're very familiar with the planetary boundaries concept. It goes much beyond that. There are several aspects to natural capital. So those two are the fundamental engines of all human progress, prosperity, growth, historically. Everything else you study in economics, including things like, finance and, technology, etc. They are nothing but accumulated surpluses of either human knowledge or exploited combination of human capital and natural capital. Now, it's a very depressing way of looking at where things are, and there's a more optimistic way. So the depressing picture is as follows, right? There has never been in our recent human history as depleted a stock of natural capital as exists today, with so many of the planetary boundaries flashing yellow and red, and with climate in particular threatening to go off the rails, and us being completely off track for 1.5 and as yet even for 2 degrees of warming. And whichever way you look at biodiversity collapse, you look at water tables, you look at sinking Jakarta in Indonesia, you look at microplastics and forever chemicals. Whichever way you look, the picture is rather depressing. And despite the fact that we've been having this discussion for decades, including on climate, even today, 10 times as much money continues to go into the further destruction of natural capital as is going into protecting or even salvaging some of that, right? The picture on the human capital side is in some ways equally bad. So all our headlines in Europe, in the United States, in Japan, in mostly rich countries are dominated by demographic decline and very tight job markets, and inflation's been driven by partly by the tight job markets. But even as we focus so inward in our discussion in the EU in particular, but also in the developed world and more generally, there has never been a bigger pool of unemployed, underemployed, brilliant human beings who will never get the opportunity to even be productively employed, leave alone being able to be the best version of themselves, which luckily, all the people in the room and I have had, right? Statistically speaking, there's at least 100 million people out there in Africa, in South Asia, and Latin America who are far smarter, and many of them, as we know, are willing to work twice as hard as us, who are just not productively employed, right? So the two engines that have brought us all prosperity and human growth of human capital and natural capital are in a rather dire state. We are wasting away the two most precious sources we have. So that's a depressing way of looking at things, right? So is there an optimistic take on this? Well, I mean, there better be. And I think there is. And that is, imagine if we were in this dire state of affairs while pursuing policies that were, economically optimal, while doing our best to make best policy, right? Then we'd be truly, genuinely screwed. And luckily, we are so far from what would be a macroeconomically optimal policy making corner that even small marginal improvements to either slowing down the destruction of natural capital or begin to sort of start salvaging and restoring it and bringing a few tens of millions of these fantastic human beings and unleashing their creativity into the globally productive workforce can generate and will generate outsized economic and environmental gains if we only got our head around to it. And my contention, based on work with several G20s, most recently the Indian G20, and the work I do at the EUI, is that there is no way forward for the global economy that does not require this to happen. And a different way of sort of conveying the same thing is, again, on the demographic side, there has never been as big a demographic asymmetry as exists today between the developed and the developing world, right? The average age in Nigeria is 17 or 18. The average age in the EU is 44. Three countries in Africa already have the same population as the whole of the EU, right? And every single year, somewhere between 20 to 25 million Indians and sub-Saharan Africans come into the workforce, most of whom will never even be formally employed. Only 3% of them will even have a formal job, leave alone again being able to contribute productively to the best of their ability to global knowledge gains. And as a friend of mine summarized when his 8-year-old asked him, Dad, what if the man who has the cure for cancer never gets a chance to go to school? And this happens day after day, every single day in our world, right? So there is a grand bargain to be made between us in the EU and the United States and Japan, the rich part of the world, who have a surplus of capital. And we also have still, despite big progress being made in China and India, the surplus of the world's sort of biggest pool of intellectual capital, intellectual property, right? And out there in the developing world, in all of Africa, large parts of South Asia and Latin America, lie both human capital reserves and natural capital reserves. As you don't need me to say that the future of whether climate change is successfully tackled or not will not be determined by the EU Green Deal. It will be determined by the actions taken or not taken by the likes of India and by sub-Saharan Africa, by large parts of Latin America, right? That is where the vast majority of the world's pool of natural capital and human capital lie. And so there's a grand bargain to be made, which is the work I've been pursuing at the G20 between these two parts of the world to find a way of reconciling the global growth that is desperately needed for the vast majority of the world's population outside of the rich world, together with the increasingly binding multiple environmental constraints that we now have to tackle all at the same time, right? I mean, the luxury of having sequentially dealt first with the carbon issue and then dealing with, clean water and then dealing with land degradation, biodiversity loss, that time is long gone. We now need to deal with all of these planetary boundaries at the same time, and the actions optimal for one often are counterproductive for the others, right? So the task is much, much harder now than it was before. So I have suggested, as a way of sort of mapping the way forward, a set of 6 compacts that are part of this grand bargain that we are trying to get the G20 to negotiate over the next coming 5 years or so. And the first part is recognizing the macro significance of the world out there, outside of the EU and the US, right? So to give you a quick example, so if India reaches half the resource intensity that China has today, the world loses 2 degrees, irrespective of what we do in the EU over the next 10, 20 years, right? And if India reaches the same resource intensity that China has today, we've lost 2.5 degrees. We'll be getting close to 3 degrees, right? So we in the EU, in Berlin and Brussels and me in Oslo, are finger pointing at the Indians and saying, don't follow the Chinese trajectory, right? Except that is the only tried and tested development model over the last century that worked for any country larger than Singapore, right? The export-led manufacturing growth model with large-scale investments in physical infrastructure, very high environmental footprint. So a central, in some ways, the most important question for global policymakers is, what is a development model a large country like India, a large region like sub-Saharan Africa, even Bangladesh, Pakistan can pursue, which looks dramatically different from everything that has gone before, right? Because as yet, this model doesn't exist. And unless and until we find a good answer, a credible answer to this question, India and Pakistan and Bangladesh and Brazil and sub-Saharan Africa and Nigeria, everybody will continue to try and copy the only thing that has worked. And in doing that, irrespective of what we say and how much finger pointing we do, how much, we talk about the degrowth narrative, it will drive the world over the precipice of environmental disaster, right? And of course, it's not okay for us, as some of our colleagues unfortunately do, to finger point at the Indian and say, sorry, guys, you missed the bus, let there be the noble poor. It, first of all, is extremely immoral and ridiculous to say that. And second, even if we say that, nobody's going to listen, as they shouldn't. So what does a new development model look like? And here, let me, Corona was hard on all of us. It was hard on me personally too, and I'm sure some of you lost some near and dear ones with a heavy emotional cost. But one of the 2 good things that came out of the Corona pandemic might actually help us save human civilization, and that was the fact that despite Zoom has existed for a long time. I had never heard of it before. I had heard of Skype. I had heard of course, when I used to be an investment banker, even back in the day, We used to have these massive virtual, dial-in rooms with big screens, etc., but nobody particularly used them. Uh, what Corona did was, at peak lockdown, 2/3 of all of American GDP and 2/3 of all of EU GDP was delivered entirely remotely, right? Clearly, that came at a heavy cost, personal cost, professional cost, productivity cost, whatever, right? But it tested the limit. It showed us what was feasible, right? 2/3 of GDP for a sustained length of time was delivered entirely remotely. Now, that has, and what it did was it mainstreamed, it socialized what was otherwise, technologically feasible, but it was just, not accepted. It socialized and normalized the remote delivery of high value added services. I'm pretty sure pre-corona, I would not be doing keynote speeches sitting in my study in Oslo, right? And here I am. So what does this do? Well, if we look at our GDP, around 80%, somewhere between 70 to 80% of EU GDP across every single country is services rather than goods, right? And this percentage keeps on rising. Clearly, I can't give Niels a haircut through Zoom yet. But there is no reason I can't do banking and consulting and government services and even education and so many other things remotely, right? So 2/3 of GDP was not equilibrium, but there is no reason that 1/3 of our GDP cannot be delivered remotely. And that raises enormous opportunities. So if we look at what happened in the last golden age of globalization, so between the fall of the Berlin Wall and China's entry into the WTO and a few years after until sort of Lehman's collapse, the number of workers engaged in globally productive supply chains and goods doubled in the world. And a lot of what we call, the golden age of globalization, the enormous, unprecedented economic growth, particularly in terms of catch-up growth we saw, in terms of poverty reduction, in terms of, fantastic stabilization of price levels, fantastic outsized financial market returns, what have you, was the consequence of a doubling of number of workers engaged in globally productive supply chains in goods, right? Now, goods, may I remind you again, is only 20-30% of our economy. Now, imagine if we were to actually let this productivity be unleashed in services. First, we immediately address our massive demographic challenges, which are only going to get worse. We give opportunities to the 25 million people coming into the workforce in India and sub-Saharan Africa alone, and we've estimated at the LSE that the global growth benefits, poverty reduction benefits, and all the sort of good stuff we got of globalization is potentially, at least conservatively speaking, twice as large as what we saw with the last golden age of globalization, right? And this is growth we desperately need for the 7 billion people who live outside of the rich world. And so that the first aspect of this is a trade compact that liberalizes this trade in high value added services and recognizes that this is the next golden age of globalization. And what's important this time round is that this kind of globalization is far more compatible with binding planetary constraints. Again, we've looked at particular case studies where an equivalent value of value-added exports in services from India has an environmental footprint less than a tenth of an equivalent value added of goods from China, for example, right? So this sort of volume expansion of trade productivity increase is far more compatible with the limited resource envelope than the last resource intensive round of growth we saw. So that's sort of the trade compact. The second is an environmental compact where we really need to update ourselves, right? It no longer has any credibility to talk with a straight face for a 1.5 degree target when this is thermodynamically, financially, politically now simply not achievable. It is far more credible to talk about, 1.8, you can pick a number, even a 2-degree target that we can actually deliver on, which is credible, while also including binding targets on biodiversity, on water, on land degradation, and others. Because, like I said, the time to deal with these sequentially is long gone. We need to tackle all of this more broadly. So that's a quid pro quo. Yes, we are going to see liberalization of trade in high value added services, great potential, new development growth models possible, but we need to have a broader, more realistic framing of environmental constraints that we all need to sign up to. A third one is a mining compact, right? So will there ever be a world where, like my prime minister in Norway said, it would make sense for Norway to do deep sea mining for a clean energy transition? And the answer is economically no, environmentally absolutely no, financially no, and morally no. I mean, it's just the stupidest possible idea one can think of, right? Will there ever be a time when the EU will be completely self-sufficient in clean mining, extraction, processing, manufacturing, everything? No, absolutely not, right? Luckily for us, the best, highest value, most easily extractable, economically viable reserves of all of the whole range of minerals we need for the green transition happen to lie in low and lower middle income countries, often in sub-Saharan Africa, in Latin America, and in Asia, right? And yes, this needs to begin with acknowledging that we truly, genuinely screwed up last time round. The resource curse is very real, right? And I think I'm one of the very few people, if not the only one, in the global macroeconomic policymaking space who's actually worked in a coal mine. The elite engineering school I went to thought it instilled values in making people who were going to be, captains of industry experience what it was like. So I spent about a month there. And in retrospect, at the time, I hated it. In retrospect, I'm very, very happy I did, right? And I guess all of you would recognize there is no such thing as a clean mine. All mines are toxic, they are filthy, they're dirty business. It's just horrible, right? And often, again, there's a whole slew of corruption associated with mining, from grand theft and larceny of the kind seen in, the Democratic Republic of Congo, to just plain old-fashioned bribery, which is fairly commonplace, even in the EU and the United States, right? And then, of course, the Dutch disease effects are very, very real. Again, from having sort of decimated whole economies to even a country like Norway, which set up what is now the world's largest sovereign wealth fund, 1.8 trillion and counting. But despite that, so much oil money leaks into the economy that Norway suffers from a modern version of the Dutch disease, which is called the Norwegian disease, which is destroying all the export competitiveness across other industries, right? So it's horrible, filthy, crappy business. But there is a huge spectrum of difference between the best and the worst performers, right? So there's a big difference between miners losing 25 years of life expectancy, as they do in some coal mines in China, versus only losing 5, right? And I, big emphasis on the word only. I'm not trivializing it. I'm just trying to make the point. There's a whole spectrum of conditions, working conditions associated, right? There's a whole degree of difference between degrees of local toxicity, cyanide leaching, dams bursting, etc., in the worst run mines, and the most and the ones that deploy the cleanest, latest, cutting-edge technology with the best safeguards, right? There's a whole difference between grand corruption and theft of the kind seen in the past versus a more modern approach which uses escrow accounts, capacity building for fair contract negotiation, and sets up, fiscal mechanisms, including sovereign wealth funds, to minimize Dutch disease, right? We know how to do it better, but we need a plan, and right now we don't have a plan. The scale of mining that is necessary, required, we need a plan, and we need to recognize that most of it needs to happen in countries that are otherwise not known for good governance and associated not with the best safeguards in either environmental standards or human rights. And we need a plan, and that has to be part of the mining compact. And again, rather than the paranoia of saying, well, the correct response to China having so much of the world's processing capacity is that Germany and France and the UK and the US and Japan, everybody needs full downstream, mining processing capacity to do all the value added. No, the correct answer is we help regions of the world, whether it's the Democratic Republic of Congo, whether it's Chile, whether it's Argentina, whether it's India, to help develop processing capacity. And the correct response is 3 or 4 centers of processing, clean mineral processing capacity. So there's a fantastic opportunity for more of the lower middle income countries with decent education systems like India to climb up the value chain using a new development model that uses the high valued exports of services. And there's an opportunity for lower income countries, particularly that don't yet have that infrastructure, but which have fantastic natural resource endowments to benefit from this clean mining. And technology has a central role to play, and it's not just about developing the most cutting edge technology, but it is about diffusion and immediately deploying it. We no longer have the luxury of time lags between technological development and large scale development in the rest of the world outside of the EU and the United States. So that's a mining compact, right? And now, how is all of this going to get funded? Because essentially what we're saying is we are trying to substitute a resource intensive development model for one that is more capital intensive, right? And here again, fortune is smiling on us. So if you look today at American, EU, Japanese large pension funds, institutional investors, 85 to 90% of our money is invested in other OECD rich economies, right? Now, you don't need to be a genius to do basic arithmetic, and let me just guide you through 3 small steps. So the first is post-World War II, the fantastic golden age we enjoyed in the rich world, and including in the EU and especially in Germany. Around half of all our growth was driven by an actual increase in the number of workers. That is gone. That was a massive tailwind, and now the actual number of workers has started declining, right? And the second part was the second half of all the growth we saw post World War II came from an increase in productivity. There again, we are close to the productivity frontier, and even with AI, etc., there are limits to how much, optimistically speaking, Germany and France are going to grow in any one year. And the answer is, we'll take 1-2% growth rate, right? Now, over the past 20, 30 years, our pension funds, institutional investors have enjoyed a golden age, having generated returns of somewhere between 7 to 8% by primarily investing in the US, Japan, and the EU, economies that have grown at maybe 2%, right? Now, you can be a tiny hedge fund. You can generate returns of 20% in an economy growing at 2% forever, right? But you cannot be the whole financial system and continue to do that unless and until, eventually the Ponzi scheme collapses. And that's where we are. So the future expected growth, financial returns on our pension fund investments in our current strategy is 2 or 3%, at which point all our pension systems are completely unviable, whether it's the American ones or the Dutch ones or the Swedish or the Norwegian ones, right? We need minimum returns of around 6% or so. Now, again, there's not a one-to-one correlation between GDP growth rates and financial profitability of investments. But again, it doesn't take a genius to guess that, a country growing at 6 to 8% is far more likely to be able to generate financial returns from investments of 6 to 8% than a country that will grow at 1 or 2%. So there is a pure financial logic to us being able to reallocate significant proportions up to about 30 or 40% of our portfolios towards countries where there is an excess of human capital, but just not enough of financial capital. This is the only sensible way, and to generate viable pension systems, irrespective of whether you cared about climate change or not. And this is also the only way of diversifying our otherwise massive overexposure to risks that the Eurozone in particular, but the rich countries and more generally face, of populism, of large existing financial and economic linkages, of sharing a common currency, etc., which we've seen the perils of. So both from a risk and an opportunity perspective, there is a financial strategy for our pension funds that doesn't need to depend on caring about climate change, that requires a large-scale reallocation towards exactly the countries that most need the money in order to be able to deliver growth models and growth rates that can save the planet from certain disaster. And last but not the least is a technological compact to complement all of these. And I've hinted at aspects of that, but to give you a couple of quick concrete examples. So I sit on the advisory boards of a number of these clean tech venture capital funds, etc. And by far, the vast majority of plans I see from the ones in the EU and the US are focused on niche premium premium product development, right? Whether it's green steel or green cement and other models, which are counting on greeniums being able to command premiums by mostly selling into the rich market, right? So I went to meet the green steel firms that have been in the news and the governments, and I said, what's the plan for large-scale rollout in India, in sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America? And I was told there wasn't one, right? And then I just had to controversially say in public, and I said, does it matter if the next installation of steel in Sweden is green? And I said, I don't think so, okay? Does it matter if all of the new infrastructure being made, being constructed, being put in place in the developing world is the latest, most cutting edge cement technology, steel technology, ammonia manufacture technology, etc.? Absolutely, yes. In between now and 2050, India, for example, is expected to use more steel and cement than all of the United States, the EU, and Latin America combined, right? And whether this is the latest bleeding cutting edge of the greenest steel and cement we have been able to come up with or not is what will determine our future. And this is not to say that I want to, piss over everybody's intellectual property, not at all, right? There is a very viable, very profitable business model, think Walmart, of low margin, very high volumes. And I think that is the hat we need to have on when we are talking about innovation, when we are talking about clean technological development, and when we are talking about the deployment and diffusion of this technology. Because without this ability to be deployed immediately with more or less no time lag across the world, across mining, across agriculture, across circular economy models, across the latest, most carbon-free steel and cement we are able to come up with, the numbers simply don't add up, and we will not make it through to the other end. So to sum up, there is a way forward, but this is, this is not to quote Mutti, but if you remember, Mrs. Merkel was fond of implying there is no alternative. And I have to echo her words on that. There is no alternative, Tina, apart from this single one, which the rough contours laid in place for you. And you guys at the technological development space, clean technological development space, have a central role to play in this. And I hope we'll all be heroes.
Excellent. Sony, thanks so much. This was great. You sort of allowed us to broaden the perspective well beyond sort of Germany and Europe, which is great, absolutely necessary. helped sort of set the stage for what is still to come. So here we have several cement experts. So ideally we help develop the breakthrough innovations in those technologies to then eventually be deployed and diffused not only on this continent, but also the other continents you mentioned, to effectively sort of deliver the decarbonization that we need. We heard about sort of the resource depletion that we currently face. Sort of we're going to hear more about some nature-based carbon removal solutions later on. There's many more points I could make on whether sovereign wealth funds can help finance the green transition. But as we are on a tight schedule, thank you so much. Yeah, big round of applause from everyone. And then